Welcome to this deep analysis of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Tell us where you're watching from. I ask that you subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue bringing stories in this format. Well, here it is. The photograph measures 8 inches by 10, its sepia tones fading unevenly across the thick paper stock characteristic of rural portrait studios in 1937. 3 figures occupy the frame against a painted backdrop depicting a parlor that never existed in the coal mining hollows of eastern Kentucky. The man stands rigid, his Sunday suit borrowed from a neighbor, one hand resting on the carved back of an ornate chair while the other hangs stiffly at his side. His face carries the weathered complexion of someone who has spent 32 years breathing coal dust and mountain air in equal measure. The woman sits in the chair, her posture unnaturally straight, wearing a cotton dress that shows careful mending at the collar and cuffs. Her expression reveals nothing, eyes fixed on a point beyond the camera lens, beyond the studio walls, perhaps beyond the mountains themselves. In her arms, wrapped in a crocheted blanket that took 6 months to complete during lamplight evenings, rests an infant whose round face suggests contentment, unaware of the transaction that brought him to this particular lap, this specific family, this moment frozen in silver halide and lies. The photograph remained in a wooden box for 8 decades, surviving 3 generations, 2 house fires, and the gradual dissolution of memory that transforms truth into legend and legend into silence. When Sarah Whitmore inherited her grandmother's estate in 2017, she found the box beneath floorboards in a bedroom closet, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine that crumbled at her touch. Inside, along with birth certificates, wedding announcements, and deed transfers documenting the mundane progression of rural American life, she discovered the photograph and a letter written in the careful script of someone for whom writing was an occasional necessity rather than daily habit. The letter explained nothing and everything, its 15 sentences containing enough truth to shatter the mythology of her family history while raising questions that could never be satisfactorily answered. Sarah spent 3 weeks reading and rereading those sentences before contacting the Appalachian Heritage Center at the university, where historians specializing in the social economics of Depression-era mountain communities recognized immediately the significance of what she had found. The story begins not in 1937 but 11 years earlier, in a hollow so narrow that sunlight reached the valley floor for only 4 hours daily even in summer. The Henderson family occupied 47 acres of steep hillside considered worthless by everyone except those desperate enough to attempt farming land that shed topsoil with every heavy rain. James Henderson had inherited the property from his father, who inherited it from his father, each generation clinging to ownership as proof of worth in a region where land ownership separated families into categories more rigid than any written law could establish. His wife Martha bore 7 children in 9 years, each birth occurring in the same iron bed with the same midwife attending, each infant arriving into circumstances slightly more desperate than the previous one. The hollow provided barely enough to sustain life, and the Depression had not yet officially begun when the Hendersons were already living its reality, consuming what they grew, wearing what they sewed, existing in an isolation that was both protection and prison. The Caldwell family lived 3 ridges over, occupying the valley floor where Bitter Creek ran year-round and the soil, though rocky, held moisture long enough to produce reliable crops. Robert Caldwell owned 212 acres acquired through strategic marriages, careful saving, and the kind of patience that allowed him to wait years for opportunities that others missed due to desperation or ignorance. He employed 6 men during planting and harvest seasons, operated a small sawmill that processed timber from his woodlots, and maintained social standing through regular church attendance and calculated generosity that ensured people remembered his kindness while forgetting the interest rates attached to his loans. His wife Elizabeth had suffered through 4 pregnancies that ended in stillbirths and miscarriages, each loss deepening a grief that manifested as silence rather than tears, withdrawal rather than seeking comfort. By 1926, she had stopped hoping for children, redirecting her maternal instincts toward maintaining the most orderly household in 3 counties and organizing the Church Ladies Auxiliary with military precision. The transaction that would eventually lead to the photograph occurred during a drought that began in May and continued through October, turning creeks to trickles and wells to mud. The Henderson family watched their vegetable garden wither despite hauling water from a spring half a mile distant, their corn stalks brown by July, their hope evaporating like moisture from the cracked earth. James Henderson owed Robert Caldwell $160, borrowed 18 months earlier to purchase a mule that subsequently died from colic, leaving him with debt but no means to work the fields more efficiently. The debt accumulated interest at rates that seemed reasonable when calculated monthly but devastating when viewed across years. By autumn, Henderson owed $230 with no prospect of payment, and Caldwell, though not cruel by the standards of the time and place, operated according to principles that did not accommodate sentiment when money was concerned. Martha Henderson discovered her 8th pregnancy in August, her body recognizing the familiar sensations despite her attempts to attribute the nausea and fatigue to poor nutrition and worry. She told no one for 6 weeks, as though silence might reverse the biological reality, as though not speaking the words might prevent another mouth arriving to share resources already insufficient for those already born. When she finally informed her husband, he received the news with the blank expression of someone who has exceeded his capacity for emotional response, who has worried beyond the point where additional concerns register as anything more than background noise to existing despair. They discussed options that were not really options, considered solutions that were not actually possible, and ultimately said nothing more about it, allowing the pregnancy to progress as inevitably as the seasons changed and debts compounded. Robert Caldwell approached James Henderson in late September, after church services that neither man attended with any spiritual conviction but both considered socially necessary. His proposal arrived wrapped in language suggesting mutual benefit and practical thinking, framed as helping rather than exploitation, presented with the kind of reasonableness that made refusal seem irrational. He would forgive the debt entirely and transfer ownership of 40 additional acres of bottom land along Bitter Creek if Henderson would agree to surrender the coming child immediately after birth, provided the infant was healthy and arrived before April. The child would be raised as a Caldwell with all advantages that name and wealth could provide in that region and era, receiving education, opportunity, and social position impossible for a Henderson to access. Caldwell emphasized his wife's desperate longing for a child, the emptiness of their home despite its material abundance, the tragedy of resources without heirs to inherit them. James Henderson listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing while his mind performed calculations comparing the certain suffering of his existing 7 children against the theoretical suffering of one not yet born, weighing the definite reality of losing land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations against the abstract moral implications of what Caldwell proposed. He asked for time to consider, though both men understood that desperation permitted only one answer. He discussed it with Martha in their bedroom that night, voices kept low so the children sleeping in the adjacent room would not hear, though the older ones probably sensed something significant occurring in the way children always sense when adult worry exceeds usual parameters. Martha cried, which she rarely allowed herself to do, her tears falling silently while her husband held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make the choice less impossible or the necessity less crushing. They agreed 3 days later, the decision announced with neither drama nor ceremony, simply acknowledged as settled and therefore requiring no further discussion. The pregnancy continued through winter, Martha's body swelling while her emotional state remained carefully neutral, performing the physical tasks of preparing for birth while maintaining psychological distance from the outcome. She sewed no baby clothes, prepared no cradle, allowed herself no maternal fantasies about the child's personality or future. The other children noticed her detachment but attributed it to exhaustion and worry, familiar states that required no explanation. James Henderson signed papers that Robert Caldwell prepared, documents transferring debt forgiveness and land ownership contingent upon delivery of a healthy infant, the language clinical and legal, reducing human life to contractual obligations and property transfer. The baby arrived on March 19th, delivered by the same midwife who had attended Martha's previous births, though this time the woman worked in unusual silence, aware that something was different without understanding. Specifically what? The infant was male, weighing 7 pounds and demonstrating strong lungs and healthy color, meeting all requirements of the agreement that governed his existence before he drew his first breath. Martha held him for 3 hours, allowing herself that time to memorize his face, to feel his weight against her chest, to perform the maternal rituals that biology demanded even as circumstance denied. She nursed him once, then handed him to the midwife with instructions to take him to the Caldwell farm, where Elizabeth Caldwell waited with bottles and blankets and a desperate hunger to mother a child who would legally and socially become hers from that moment forward. The land transfer was recorded at the county courthouse 2 weeks later. 40 acres of fertile bottomland along Bitter Creek changing ownership from Caldwell to Henderson, the transaction appearing in public records as a sale. For $1 and other valuable considerations, language conventional enough to attract no attention or speculation. The baby, named Thomas Robert Caldwell, was baptized at the Methodist Church 6 weeks after birth, Elizabeth Caldwell holding him with fierce possessiveness while Robert Caldwell stood beside her projecting satisfaction and vindication, their status as parents accepted without question by a community that asked few questions about private family matters and considered discretion a virtue more important than curiosity. Thomas Caldwell grew into boyhood unaware of the transaction that had determined his fate, accepting his place in the household with the unquestioning acceptance children bring to whatever circumstances they inhabit. Elizabeth Caldwell devoted herself to his upbringing with an intensity that might have seemed excessive if observers had not known about her previous losses and understood her fierce determination that this child would survive, would thrive, would justify the years of grief and the means by which he had arrived. She monitored his health obsessively, consulting doctors in town for minor complaints that other mothers would have treated with home remedies, ensuring his diet included fresh milk and eggs and meat with regularity unusual for the region and period. Robert Caldwell, less emotionally demonstrative but equally committed to the project of raising an heir, focused on education and practical skills, hiring tutors when the local school proved inadequate, teaching the boy land management and business principles, preparing him for eventual ownership of property and enterprises that represented 3 generations of accumulation. The boy displayed intelligence and curiosity, traits encouraged through access to books, magazines, and newspapers that arrived by mail from cities that existed beyond the mountains in a world of commerce and culture remote from daily reality in eastern Kentucky. He learned to read before attending school, absorbed mathematics with facility that pleased his father, and demonstrated mechanical aptitude that suggested futures involving engineering or industry rather than agriculture. His childhood occurred in material comfort rare for the time and place, insulated from the poverty that surrounded the Caldwell property like water surrounds an island, aware of hardship only as abstraction observed from distance rather than experienced directly. The Henderson family meanwhile struggled through the 30s on land that remained barely adequate despite the 40 additional acres that had purchased Thomas's departure. The extra acreage along Bitter Creek allowed James Henderson to plant cash crops that generated modest income, reducing though not eliminating the perpetual financial anxiety that characterized life in the Hollow. The 7 children who remained grew up understanding that resources were scarce, that education beyond 8th grade was luxury rather than expectation, that their futures would likely replicate their parents' lives with minor variations determined more by chance than choice. Martha Henderson performed her maternal duties with competence but maintained emotional reserve that her children attributed to temperament rather than recognizing as protective mechanism against pain too large to acknowledge. She never spoke of the 8th child, and her husband honored that silence, the absence existing between them like a third presence in their marriage, acknowledged through avoidance rather than discussion. Thomas encountered the Henderson children occasionally at church or in town, passing exchanges that carried no significance for him beyond momentary interaction with peers from different social circumstances. He noticed their worn clothing and rough manners without judgment, accepting class distinction as natural feature of social organization, unaware that he was observing his biological siblings, that the woman who watched him with particular intensity during these encounters had carried him for 9 months and made an impossible choice that haunted her every day since. Martha Henderson attended church specifically to see him, timing her visits to coincide with services the Caldwells attended, positioning herself where she could watch him without appearing to stare, cataloging his growth and development with attention mothers reserve for their own children while maintaining external composure that revealed nothing to casual observers. By age 12, Thomas had developed into a boy whose features combined elements from both biological parents in ways that might have suggested genetic connection to anyone looking carefully and comparing, but casual observation revealed no obvious similarities that would prompt questions or speculation. He possessed his biological father's build and his biological mother's eyes, combinations random enough to appear coincidental rather than inherited. His personality reflected the nurture more than nature, shaped by privilege and expectation rather than hardship and resignation, confident in ways that children of poverty rarely develop, comfortable with authority and social interaction in manner that suggested he expected the world to accommodate rather than obstruct him. Elizabeth Caldwell's devotion intensified rather than diminished as the boy aged, her identity increasingly defined by motherhood, her daily routines organized around his needs and schedules, her conversations dominated by his achievements and future prospects. Other women in the Church Ladies' Auxiliary recognized her obsessiveness but interpreted it as natural result of finally having a child after years of longing, forgivable excess given her history of loss. Robert Caldwell, more measured in expression but equally invested in outcome, began introducing Thomas to business associates and community leaders, positioning him for eventual assumption of responsibilities and status, building networks that would support his adult life in a region where connections mattered more than credentials or merit. The photograph that would eventually reveal the transaction was taken when Thomas was 11 months old, commissioned by Robert Caldwell to mark the completion of legal adoption proceedings that formalized what everyone already accepted as reality. The session occurred at Mitchell's photography studio in town, the only establishment within 50 miles equipped with proper lighting and backdrops, operated by a man who had learned the craft in Cincinnati before returning to the mountains for reasons he never explained but which local gossip attributed to scandal or failure. Elizabeth Caldwell dressed the baby in a gown she had sewn from fabric ordered from a catalog, white cotton with elaborate embroidery at collar and cuffs, garment suitable for christening or burial, elevated far beyond everyday functionality. She had insisted on being included in the photograph despite Robert's initial preference for a portrait of the child alone, her participation non-negotiable, her need to be visibly documented as mother overriding his vision of independent heir. The photographer arranged them according to conventions of the period, the family unit position to suggest stability and prosperity, the painted backdrop providing context of genteel domesticity that contrasted with the actual circumstances of most clients who entered his studio. He worked quickly, aware that infant cooperation was temporary condition subject to sudden termination, capturing 6 exposures in 15 minutes before the baby began crying and the session ended. Of the 6 negatives, only one achieved the technical and compositional quality that justified printing and framing, the image that would survive 8 decades to eventually reveal secrets its subjects believed would remain forever hidden. The adoption papers filed at the courthouse listed Elizabeth and Robert Caldwell as parents, with notation indicating the mother's previous name as Elizabeth Morris, standard procedure designed to create legal fiction of biological parentage. No mention appeared of Martha Henderson or the circumstances of Thomas's birth, the transaction occurring outside official channels, documented only in private papers that Robert Caldwell maintained in a safe deposit box at the bank where he served on the board of directors. The papers included the agreement James Henderson had signed, the land transfer documents, and a letter from Martha Henderson relinquishing all parental rights and swearing never to reveal the arrangement or attempt contact with the child. Language drafted by an attorney in town who had processed similar transactions several times before and understood the necessity of documentation without requiring explanation of motivation or circumstances. Thomas celebrated his 10th birthday in 1936 with a party attended by 20 children from families of similar social standing, an event featuring store-bought cake and gifts that included a bicycle and a watch and books ordered from catalogs. Abundance marking the occasion as significant milestone. Martha Henderson learned of the party through her eldest daughter, who heard about it from a classmate who had attended, the information arriving secondhand and late, a reminder of the distance between her daily reality and the life her 8th child lived 3 ridges over in a world she could observe only from outside. She allowed herself one evening of grief, crying in the privacy of her bedroom after her family had fallen asleep, mourning not just the child she had surrendered but the impossibility of ever explaining the choice to anyone who might understand without judging, the isolation of carrying knowledge too shameful to share yet too significant to forget. The years progressed with the relentless forward motion that permits no revision or reconsideration, each day adding distance from the transaction that had occurred in 1927, each month making the truth seem more remote and less relevant, each year strengthening the fiction that Thomas had always been a Caldwell and would remain one forever. The land James Henderson had received produced modest prosperity that lifted his family from desperation to merely difficult circumstances, improvements significant enough to justify the price paid though not sufficient to eliminate the cost's emotional weight. Martha Henderson occasionally encountered Thomas in town, brief passings that she extended through pretense of shopping or conversation with acquaintances, stealing moments to observe the boy who carried half her genetic material but none of her daily reality, memorizing changes in his appearance while maintaining the careful distance the agreement required. Thomas Caldwell enlisted in the Army 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, motivated by patriotism and adventure-seeking typical of 18-year-old men facing the first significant decision of their adult lives. His parents opposed the enlistment with arguments emphasizing education and economic deferment, but their opposition carried less weight than his determination to participate in events he recognized as historically significant. He trained at Fort Campbell, then shipped to Europe with the Third Army, experiencing combat in France and Germany that transformed him from boy to man through mechanisms brutal and permanent. He returned in 1946, changed in ways that Elizabeth Caldwell mourned and Robert Caldwell recognized as necessary evolution from protected youth to capable adult, ready to assume responsibilities that his father's advancing age made increasingly urgent. The GI Bill enabled college education that would have otherwise been financially possible but seemed unnecessary luxury given his guaranteed inheritance and established social position. Thomas enrolled at the State University, studying business administration and agricultural economics, subjects practical rather than passionate but appropriate for someone whose future involved managing existing enterprises rather than creating new ones. He met Catherine Morrison during his sophomore year, a professor's daughter from Lexington who found his mountain background exotic and his prospects attractive, combination sufficient to inspire romance that progressed to engagement and marriage with speed acceptable in the post-war period when delayed gratification seemed foolish given the decade's demonstration of life's fragility. They settled on the Caldwell property in a house Robert built for them on land overlooking Bitter Creek. A wedding gift that included 40 acres and the expectation that Thomas would gradually assume control of family operations as his father transitioned toward retirement. Thomas performed this role competently if not enthusiastically, managing timber sales and crop production, maintaining relationships with banks and suppliers, navigating the economic transformation occurring in Appalachia as mechanization and consolidation made small-scale farming increasingly unviable. He and Catherine produced 3 children in 5 years, establishing the next generation that would continue the Caldwell presence in a region experiencing depopulation as young people departed for cities offering opportunities impossible to find in hollows where coal mines closed and farms failed. Martha Henderson died in 1953, cancer consuming her across 8 months with progression that appeared merciful only in comparison to slower deteriorations observed in others. James Henderson buried her in the family cemetery on the hillside above the hollow, marking the grave with a stone purchased at cost that still strained his finances, words carved in granite insufficient to capture the complexity of a life lived in resignation and sacrifice. The 7 children who survived her attended the funeral along with neighbors who remembered her as quiet woman who kept to herself but fulfilled obligations of community membership through church attendance and mutual aid when others faced crisis. Thomas Caldwell did not attend, unaware of any connection to the deceased woman, his absence unremarkable given the social distance between families of different classes and the lack of obvious relationship. James Henderson survived his wife by 18 months, dying in his sleep at age 63, exhaustion and poverty accumulating to terminal conclusion without dramatic incident or extended suffering. His children inherited the land that had cost them a brother none of them knew about, dividing the property in portions that made economic survival difficult and impossible simultaneously, most of them selling within a decade to developers or timber companies, leaving the hollow to return to forest as humans abandoned places that had never quite supported them adequately. Among the possessions distributed was a wooden box containing papers and photographs that the eldest son examined briefly before storing in his attic, considering them mildly interesting historical artifacts but nothing requiring immediate attention or preservation. Robert Caldwell died in 1957, heart failure arriving without warning to claim him during morning coffee, dropping him into death while reading the newspaper's commodity prices and contemplating the day's necessary tasks. His funeral drew attendance that reflected his status and influence. The service, conducted by 3 ministers and attended by business leaders and elected officials from across the region, eulogies emphasizing his generosity and vision while omitting the ruthlessness and calculation that had enabled his accumulation. Thomas inherited the entirety of the estate, including land, equipment, accounts, and investments totaling value impressive for rural Kentucky, wealth sufficient to establish his family's security for multiple generations if managed conservatively and expanded modestly. Elizabeth Caldwell declined rapidly after her husband's death, grief manifesting as physical deterioration that no medical intervention could slow or reverse, her identity so completely bound to being Robert's wife that his absence left her without coherent sense of self. She died in 1959. Following him into the cemetery where Caldwell family members had rested since the 1800s, reunited with the man who had enabled her motherhood through transactions she had never questioned and never regretted, believing to her final breath that Thomas was fully and legitimately hers in every sense that mattered. Her death affected Thomas profoundly, triggering grief compounded by guilt over relief he felt at being freed from her increasingly demanding dependence, complex emotions he processed through work and withdrawal rather than conversation or counseling. Among Elizabeth's possessions was the photograph from 1937 and a wooden box containing letters and legal documents that Thomas discovered while clearing out the house where he had grown up. He examined the contents superficially, recognizing birth certificates and property deeds but not reading them carefully, assuming they were standard family records requiring filing but not immediate attention. He stored the box in his own attic alongside similar containers inherited from his father, historical materials that seemed potentially valuable for future genealogical interest but not urgent for present purposes. The photograph he framed and displayed in his study, one of few images capturing him with both parents, physical evidence of family unit that he remembered as stable and loving despite the reality that half of its foundation rested on transaction he would not discover for another 5 decades. The region continued changing through the 60s and 70s. Coal industry mechanization eliminating jobs while strip mining destroyed landscapes, young people departing in waves that left behind aging. Population clinging to places that offered primarily nostalgia and identity rather than opportunity or prosperity. Thomas Caldwell adapted by diversifying into real estate development and commercial property, converting agricultural assets into shopping centers and housing subdivisions, accumulating additional wealth while watching the culture that had shaped his upbringing dissolve into memory and museum exhibits. His children attended universities in other states and established careers in cities remote from eastern Kentucky, returning for holidays and weddings but building lives disconnected from the mountains that had defined previous generations. Catherine Caldwell developed Alzheimer's disease in the early 2000s, losing herself across a decade with cruelty that seemed designed to maximize suffering for everyone involved. Thomas cared for her at home until safety considerations made that impossible, then moved her to a facility in Lexington where she died in 2012 without recognizing him during the final 3 years. He returned to the house on Bitter Creek alone at age 87, occupying rooms filled with artifacts from a life that seemed increasingly disconnected from present reality, spending days reading and walking and avoiding the silence that made absence more noticeable. Sarah Whitmore had grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather Thomas Caldwell, tales emphasizing his military service and business success, painting him as figure of achievement and respectability worthy of family pride. She visited him quarterly after her great-grandmother's death, dutifully performing the kinship obligations of a granddaughter to an aging relative, their conversations polite but not particularly intimate, separated by generational distance and lack of common experience. When he died in 2016 at age 93, she inherited the house and its contents, a bequest that reflected her status as only family member who had maintained regular contact rather than special relationship or particular favorability. The process of clearing the house required 6 months of weekends and vacation days, sorting through accumulations from multiple lifetimes, making decisions about what to preserve and what to discard when every object carried some historical weight but practical limitations made keeping everything impossible. Sarah hired an estate sale company to handle furniture and household goods, donated boxes of books to the library, filed important documents with appropriate institutions, and gradually reduced a life to manageable components that could be distributed or disposed of according to conventional processes. The wooden boxes in the attic initially appeared unremarkable, containers of old papers that required examination but promised little interest beyond genealogical data for potential future research. The photograph caught her attention because of its quality and age, professional portrait from an era when such images were expensive and therefore reserved for significant occasions. She recognized Thomas as infant and could identify the adults as Elizabeth and Robert Caldwell based on other photographs she had seen, though these showed them younger than in any other images she possessed. She set it aside for framing, planning to display it as interesting family artifact, representation of heritage worth preserving even without dramatic significance. The letter accompanying it was folded beneath the photograph, yellowed paper covered in handwriting that took concentration to decipher, sentences constructed by someone for whom written communication was challenging but necessary. The letter's content required 3 readings before Sarah fully comprehended its meaning, each reading forcing revision of assumptions about family history and identities she had accepted without question. Martha Henderson's words explained the circumstances of Thomas's birth, the transaction that had transferred him from poverty to privilege, the pain of surrendering a child while watching him grow up 3 ridges distant, the impossibility of ever revealing truth without destroying relationships and reputations. The letter had been written in 1971, 2 years before Martha's death, addressed to no one and never sent, confession recorded for purposes that remained unclear but perhaps simply represented need to acknowledge reality in permanent form even if that acknowledgement remained private. Sarah contacted the Appalachian Heritage Center after confirming the letter's contents against public records, discovering that land transfers and adoption documents aligned with Martha Henderson's account, that her great-grandfather had been born to parents who were not the Caldwells, that the family history she had inherited was built on transaction that would have been scandalous if revealed but remained hidden until everyone involved had died. The historians recognized immediately the significance of the discovery, not as unique occurrence but as documented example of practice that had occurred throughout the region during the Depression, transactions involving children that were whispered about but rarely confirmed through concrete evidence. The photograph became object of analysis rather than simple family portrait, historians examining it for details that might reveal information about the subjects and circumstances. They noted Elizabeth Caldwell's expression, the intensity with which she held the infant, the possessiveness visible even through the formality of the posed studio setting. They observed Robert Caldwell's positioning, standing rather than sitting, maintaining slight distance from wife and child, presence suggesting authority and ownership rather than paternal warmth. They saw in the infant's face the innocence of someone unaware that his entire future had been determined by negotiation and exchange, that his identity and opportunities derived from transaction treating him as commodity rather than person. Sarah struggled with decisions about what to do with the information, understanding that revealing it would revise family history in ways that might dishonor people who could not defend themselves or explain their choices. She consulted with historians who urged preservation and eventual publication, arguing that historical truth mattered more than protecting reputations of people long dead, that understanding how poverty and desperation drove such transactions was important for comprehending the region's social and economic history. She contacted living Henderson family members, discovering cousins she had not known existed, people who were as shocked as she was to learn about the connection between families they had assumed were unrelated. The Henderson family had their own version of the photograph, discovered among possessions inherited from James Henderson's eldest son, who had kept the wooden box in his attic until his own death. Their photograph showed Martha Henderson holding an infant in settings that was clearly not a professional studio, outdoor image captured by someone with basic camera skills, the mother's expression revealing grief and love in equal measure, evidence of bond that would be broken within hours of the image's capture. This photograph had never been displayed, stored instead with papers that documented land transactions and debts, context suggesting it was kept as record of cost rather than celebration of child. The two photographs together told story more completely than either could alone, visual evidence of how class and economics had determined infants' trajectory, how choice that appeared voluntary was actually coerced by circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control, how transaction benefited some, while traumatizing others in ways that persisted across decades. Historians compared the images, noting differences in quality and setting, contrasting the professional formality of the Caldwell photograph with the informal authenticity of the Henderson image, recognizing how even the physical artifacts reflected the inequality that had made the transaction possible. Sarah authorized publication of the discovery through the Heritage Center, allowing historians to present the findings at conferences and in academic journals, contributing to scholarship on Depression-era survival strategies and the informal adoption networks that had operated throughout rural America during economic crisis. The photographs were digitized and archived, made available to researchers studying Appalachian history and social economics, becoming teaching tools for courses examining how poverty shapes human behavior and how desperation makes choices that should be impossible seem necessary. The revelation changed nothing about legal relationships or inheritance rights, the statute of limitations having expired decades earlier even if anyone had standing to challenge the adoption. Thomas Caldwell had lived and died as a Caldwell, his biological origins irrelevant to practical questions of identity and belonging. But the discovery changed how Sarah understood her family history, introducing complexity and tragedy into narratives she had previously accepted as straightforward success stories, forcing recognition that privilege often derives from others' pain, that achievement builds on foundations of sacrifice that beneficiaries rarely acknowledge or even recognize. She visited the hollow where the Henderson family had lived, finding only foundation stones and overgrown fields, the house long since collapsed and the land returned to forest. She stood where Martha Henderson had stood, looking toward the ridge that separated this narrow valley from Bitter Creek and the Caldwell property beyond, imagining the woman who had spent years watching that ridge while knowing her child lived on the other side, close enough to walk to but separated by social distance that might as well have been continental divide. She understood in that moment how geography reflects and reinforces inequality, how proximity means nothing when barriers of class and circumstance create separation more absolute than any physical distance could achieve. The photograph that had seemed ordinary revealed itself as documentation of transaction that was simultaneously common and extraordinary, typical of practices that occurred frequently enough to constitute pattern while remaining hidden enough to avoid historical record. It became artifact testifying to resilience and desperation, to love expressed through surrender rather than retention, to choices that were not really choices but responses to circumstances that offered no good options. The baby in Elizabeth Caldwell's arms had been traded for land, but the transaction involved more than simple exchange of property and person. It represented the way poverty strips dignity and autonomy, the way economic necessity forces decisions that violate fundamental human attachments, the way some people's comfort requires others' suffering in systems structured to maintain rather than challenge those inequalities. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.